My brother, this is something he's been waiting for, and he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support, and that's what we need to do.
And what does that shift look like for you?
Well, that's we don't know yet.
They tried to silence her. They thought the secret was safe. But Princess Anne shattered everything. What she just confirmed about King Charles will make your blood run cold. The palace is in absolute chaos. Staff are fleeing, advisors are scrambling, and the one truth they desperately tried to hide is now exploding across the world. You need to hear this before they take it down. What happens next will change the royal family forever. For years, the British royal family has been synonymous with composure, tradition, and an almost superhuman ability to maintain dignity under pressure.
This relationship, which, with good reason, we and our predecessors have long called special, has made us safer and stronger through the generations. Our people have fought and died together for the values we hold dear. We have innovated, traded, and created together.
Yet in recent months, something unprecedented has unfolded behind the gilded doors of Buckingham Palace. Princess Anne, widely regarded as the most unflappable member of the royal family, was reportedly seen in tears following a private revelation about King Charles. The incident has sent ripples of concern through royal circles and raised questions about what could possibly shake someone known for her remarkable steadiness. Princess Anne has built a reputation over decades of public service as someone who simply doesn't crack under pressure. She has stood beside her late mother, Queen Elizabeth, through some of the monarchy's most challenging periods without ever appearing to waver. Royal commentators and historians have long pointed to Anne as the embodiment of the old guard, someone who understands that showing emotion publicly is often seen as a weakness within the institution. So when reports emerged of her visibly distressed, wiping away tears in a secluded corridor away from public view, those who witnessed it understood immediately that something significant had occurred. The incident reportedly took place on an otherwise ordinary day at the palace. Staff members going about their regular duties noticed an unusual tension in the air. Security protocols were suddenly tightened in certain areas, and senior aides were seen moving with uncommon urgency through the historic hallways. According to those present, Anne had been summoned to receive what was described as a confidential document. What happened next caught even seasoned palace insiders off guard. Anne emerged from a private chamber looking, in the words of one observer, completely shaken. Her usual confident stride was absent, replaced by an almost hesitant gait, as she clutched a letter close to her chest. Witnesses described her face as drained of color, her expression one of genuine shock. For someone who has attended countless state functions, weathered family scandals, and maintained her composure through personal loss, this reaction was extraordinary. One member of staff, speaking on condition of anonymity, noted that Anne appeared to be processing information that fundamentally challenged her understanding of a situation she thought she knew well. The tears came moments later, in a corridor that staff knew she often used when seeking a moment of privacy away from the constant scrutiny that comes with royal life. Palace officials moved quickly to contain the situation. Corridors were cleared, staff were quietly reminded of their confidentiality obligations, and there was a noticeable effort to ensure no photographers or unauthorized personnel were anywhere near the area. The speed and thoroughness of this response suggested that whatever had transpired was not a minor family matter, but something with potentially serious implications for the monarchy itself. Within hours, despite the lockdown on information, whispers began to circulate among palace employees. The nature of royal households means that secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, tend to find their way through the ranks of those who serve the family. The speculation that followed was intense. Some suggested that Anne had learned of a personal struggle that Charles had been concealing from the family. Others wondered if the information related to matters of state or succession. Veterans of previous royal crises noted that the atmosphere felt reminiscent of other pivotal moments in the monarchy's recent history. at times when the institution itself seemed to teeter on uncertain ground. The comparison that kept arising was to the immediate aftermath of Princess Diana's death, when the royal family faced a crisis of public confidence and internal turmoil that threatened to reshape the monarchy permanently. What made Anne's reaction particularly alarming to those who knew her well was the timing. Just days before a major public engagement, such an emotional display from someone so disciplined suggested that whatever she had learned could not be compartmentalized or set aside. This was not the behavior of someone who had received mildly troubling news. This was the reaction of a person whose fundamental assumptions about a situation had been completely upended. Royal experts have pointed out that Anne has always been the family member who could be counted on to maintain perspective, to separate personal feelings from duty, and to present a united front regardless of private disagreements. In the days following the incident, Anne's behavior only deepened the mystery. She withdrew from several scheduled public appearances, offering minimal explanation through palace communications offices. For someone with her work ethic and commitment to royal duties, such cancellations were highly unusual. She retreated into the private family quarters of the palace, avoiding even routine interactions with staff members she had known for years. Those close to the situation understood that Anne was not simply taking a break or dealing with a minor personal matter. She was processing something that required serious contemplation away from public scrutiny. The letter she had been clutching became the subject of intense speculation among palace insiders. What could possibly be written in a document that would affect Anne so profoundly? Royal correspondence is typically formal, measured, and carefully worded. Whatever this letter contained clearly broke from that tradition. Some theorized it was a personal confession from Charles, while others suggested it might contain information about decisions that had been made without consulting the wider family. The fact that it appeared to be a private communication, rather than an official palace document, only added to the intrigue. To understand the full weight of this moment, it is important to consider the relationship between Anne and Charles. As siblings who have both dedicated their lives to royal service, they share a unique bond forged through decades of public duty. Anne has often been described as one of the few people Charles truly trusts, someone whose judgment he values and whose discretion he relies upon. For her to be kept in the dark about something significant enough to cause such distress suggests a level of secrecy that goes beyond normal palace protocol. It implies that Charles, for whatever reason, felt he could not or should not share this information with even his most trusted sibling. The speculation intensified when observers began connecting Anne's emotional breakdown to changes in Charles's behavior that had been noted in preceding weeks. Those with regular access to the king had noticed subtle shifts in his demeanor. He appeared more withdrawn during certain meetings, sometimes seeming distracted or preoccupied when he would normally be fully engaged. There were reports of him excusing himself unexpectedly from discussions, of spending long hours alone in his private study, and of a general sense that something was weighing heavily on his mind. At the time, these observations were dismissed as the normal pressures of monarchy, but in light of Anne's reaction, they took on new significance. The weeks leading up to Anne's emotional breakdown had been marked by an atmosphere of growing unease within palace walls. Those who worked closely with the royal family began noticing patterns that, individually, might seem insignificant, but collectively painted a picture of something brewing beneath the surface. King Charles, who had spent his entire life preparing for the role he now occupied, appeared to be struggling in ways that defied easy explanation. His behavior had shifted from the confident, if sometimes particular manner, that characterized his early months as monarch, to something more guarded and distant. Senior advisors who had worked with Charles for years found themselves increasingly puzzled by his conduct during what should have been routine meetings. He would arrive prepared, engage in discussions, but then suddenly withdraw, offering vague explanations before retreating to his private quarters. These weren't the actions of someone dealing with a busy schedule or the normal pressures of kingship. There was a quality to his withdrawal that suggested something deeper, something he was actively trying to conceal. Staff members exchanged concerned glances during these moments, but maintained the professional discretion expected within the palace. Nobody wanted to be the first to voice what many were beginning to suspect, that the king was dealing with something he felt unable to share. The late-night activity in Charles's private study became another source of quiet concern. Palace staff working evening shifts reported seeing lights burning well past midnight, sometimes into the early hours of the morning. The sounds of pacing could occasionally be heard through the heavy doors, along with the rustle of papers being moved and rearranged. For a man who had always maintained relatively disciplined hours, this shift to nocturnal vigils was notable. Some speculated he was working on significant policy initiatives or preparing for upcoming state matters. Others sensed something more personal at play, a man wrestling with decisions or circumstances that gave him no peace. Anne, with her characteristic directness, was among the first to confront Charles about his changed demeanor. Unlike other family members who might approach such matters more delicately, Anne went straight to her brother seeking answers. According to sources familiar with the exchange, she pressed him directly about what was troubling him, making clear that his evasiveness was not going unnoticed. The conversation did not go as she might have hoped. Charles responded with reassurances that felt hollow, offering explanations that raised more questions than they answered. His eyes, typically so direct and commanding, seemed to avoid hers throughout the exchange. For Anne, this single interaction confirmed her worst suspicions. Something serious was unfolding, and she was being deliberately kept outside the circle of knowledge. The situation was complicated further by Queen Camilla's role in managing access to Charles. In what appeared to be a protective gesture, Camilla increasingly positioned herself as a gatekeeper, controlling who could speak with the king and under what circumstances. She deflected inquiries with practiced ease, always maintaining that she was simply helping to manage Charles's schedule and ensure he had the space needed to focus on his duties. To some, this seemed like the natural role of a supportive spouse. To Anne, however, it felt like obstruction. The already complex relationship between the two women, built on years of public and private history, began to show signs of serious strain. Anne found herself repeatedly blocked from having the candid conversations with Charles that had been a feature of their relationship for decades. Camilla's interventions were always polite, always framed as being in Charles's best interests. But the effect was unmistakable. A barrier had been erected between Anne and her brother, one that she had neither anticipated nor authorized. The trust between Anne and Camilla, never robust to begin with, began to deteriorate rapidly. What had been a relationship of mutual tolerance started transforming into something closer to opposition, with each woman viewing the other's actions through an increasingly suspicious lens. Within the palace, the tension became palpable. Staff members could sense the shifting dynamics, even if they did not fully understand the causes. Conversations would stop when certain people entered rooms. Meetings that would normally include specific individuals were suddenly held with different participants. The careful choreography that typically governs palace life was being disrupted by undercurrents of conflict that no amount of protocol could completely mask. Senior courtiers, some of whom had served through multiple administrations of the royal family, privately noted that the atmosphere reminded them of previous periods of internal division, though the exact nature of this particular conflict remained frustratingly opaque. Then came the discovery of the letter. During preparations for an upcoming royal event, staff members were tasked with reviewing archived materials to select items of historical significance for display. It was routine work, the kind of careful cataloging and preservation that happens constantly within the vast collections held by the royal household. One particular aide, known for their meticulous attention to detail and long service to Anne, came across something unexpected. Tucked among innocuous files, deliberately misfiled in a way that suggested someone wanted it hidden but not destroyed, was an envelope bearing the royal seal and Charles's distinctive handwriting. The aide immediately recognized that this was not a ceremonial document or formal correspondence. The handwriting was personal, hurried in places, the kind of script someone produces when writing for themselves rather than for official record. The seal was intact, suggesting the letter had never been officially delivered or filed through proper channels. Understanding the sensitivity of what they had found, and aware of the recent tensions within the palace, the aide made the decision to bring it directly to Anne, rather than following normal archival procedures. This choice would prove pivotal in everything that followed. When Anne received the envelope, her instincts immediately sharpened. She recognized her brother's hand before even breaking the seal. This was not the careful, measured writing he used for state documents or official communications. This was raw, unfiltered, the written equivalent of thoughts poured out in a moment of private desperation or clarity. Opening the letter felt like crossing a threshold, an acknowledgement that she was about to access information that had been deliberately kept from her. The act itself was significant. A sister choosing to break through the walls of secrecy that had been constructed around matters she believed she had a right to understand. The contents of the letter exceeded even her worst expectations. Charles had not written a simple note or brief explanation. Instead, she found herself reading what amounted to a confession, an outpouring of emotion and circumstance that revealed the depth of his private struggles. He wrote about sleepless nights and the crushing weight of expectations, about feeling trapped in a role that demanded perfection, while offering little room for human vulnerability. The letter contained admissions about his health, about fears he had shared with no one, about the constant scrutiny that made every moment feel like a performance from which there was no respite. But the letter went beyond personal anguish. Woven throughout the emotional confession were references to decisions Charles had already made, steps he had taken without consultation. There were mentions of discussions held with individuals outside the traditional advisory circles, hints at plans relating to succession and the future structure of the monarchy. Anne read certain passages multiple times, trying to fully grasp their implications. Her brother had not only been suffering in silence, he had been actively making choices that would affect the entire institution, choices that bypassed the very people who should have been involved in such deliberations. The realization hit Anne with devastating force. This was not simply a case of a brother protecting his sister from worry. This was evidence of a parallel decision-making process, one that excluded her and others despite their decades of loyal service and their right to be informed. The letter revealed that Charles had already set certain mechanisms in motion, that what she was learning about was not a possibility being considered, but actions already underway. The sense of betrayal was compounded by the timing. How long had he been planning this? How many conversations had they had where he had actively concealed these developments? Anne's decision about what to do with this information came swiftly. She was not someone who believed in indirect approaches or waiting for the right moment. Armed with the letter and the undeniable proof of what had been kept from her, she immediately sought out Charles for a direct confrontation. The meeting that followed would become one of those rare moments when the carefully maintained facade of royal unity cracked wide open, revealing the very human conflicts that exist behind the ceremonial grandeur. What transpired between them was not a polite disagreement or a diplomatic exchange of views. It was a collision of betrayal and justification, of loyalty tested against the limits of acceptable secrecy. The confrontation between Anne and Charles was supposed to remain private, contained within the soundproof walls of a secure palace chamber. But emotions that have been suppressed for too long rarely respect the boundaries set for them. Within minutes of the meeting beginning, raised voices could be heard echoing down corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama, but rarely such raw, unfiltered conflict between sitting members of the family. Staff members nearby found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being unable to avoid overhearing fragments of an argument that was clearly tearing at the fabric of familial bonds. Anne entered that room carrying not just the letter, but months of accumulated frustration and concern. Her voice, typically measured and controlled even in moments of disagreement, carried an edge that startled those who knew her well. She demanded answers with a directness that left no room for the usual royal evasions. Why had Charles hidden his struggles from her? Why had he made decisions of such magnitude without involving those who had stood beside him through every challenge? The questions came rapidly, each one landing with the weight of decades of shared history and mutual trust that now felt betrayed. Charles, who had perhaps expected his sister to approach the situation with her characteristic pragmatism, found himself completely unprepared for the force of her anger. His initial attempts at explanation stumbled over themselves, words failing to adequately convey the complex mix of fear, duty, and isolation that had driven his choices. He tried to frame his secrecy as protection, as a way of shielding the family from burdens they should not have to carry. But Anne rejected this justification outright. She reminded him sharply that their entire lives had been defined by carrying burdens together, that the strength of the institution had always rested on shared sacrifice and mutual support, not on isolated decision-making. The argument escalated as Anne articulated what she saw as the fundamental breach of trust. She spoke about their bond as siblings, forged not just through blood, but through decades of standing side by side through public scandals, family tragedies, and institutional crises. They had weathered the aftermath of failed marriages, the death of their mother, the constant evolution of public opinion about the monarchy itself. Through all of it, there had been an understanding that they were in it together, that neither would make consequential decisions without at least consulting the other. For Charles to have abandoned that principle, to have acted unilaterally on matters affecting the entire family and institution, felt to Anne like a repudiation of everything their relationship had meant. Charles attempted to explain the pressures he had been under, the way constant scrutiny had made vulnerability feel impossible. He described the weight of expectation that came with the crown, the sense that any admission of weakness would be seized upon by critics of the monarchy and used to undermine the institution. His voice carried genuine anguish as he spoke about the impossible position of being expected to embody strength and continuity while dealing with very human struggles. He had convinced himself that silence was strength, that bearing these burdens alone was what duty demanded. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see in Anne's expression that she found these justifications inadequate. The dynamic shifted when Queen Camilla attempted to intervene. Sensing that the confrontation was spiraling beyond productive territory, she stepped forward with calming words designed to lower the temperature in the room. Her intervention was well-intentioned, an attempt to protect Charles from what she perceived as an overwhelming emotional assault, but her involvement had precisely the opposite effect. Anne turned her attention to Camilla with barely concealed fury. This confrontation was between siblings, between two people who had known each other their entire lives, and who shared a bond that predated any other relationship either of them had formed. Camilla's attempt to mediate was received not as helpful, but as yet another example of the gatekeeping that had kept Anne in the dark for so long. The exchange between Anne and Camilla revealed the depth of the divide that had opened within the palace. Anne made clear that she viewed Camilla's protective stance around Charles as part of the problem, rather than the solution. The implication was unmistakable. Camilla had been complicit in the secrecy, had perhaps even encouraged it as a means of consolidating her own influence. Camilla, for her part, maintained that everything she had done was in Charles's best interests and for the stability of the monarchy. The clash between these two strong-willed women laid bare the competing visions for how the royal family should operate, with Anne advocating for transparency within the family circle, and Camilla defending tighter control of information. Outside the chamber, the atmosphere among palace staff grew increasingly tense. Courtiers who had worked together for years found themselves uncertain about how to proceed, sensing that allegiances were being tested in ways that could have lasting consequences. The argument they could partly hear through the walls was not just a family dispute. It was a power struggle that would inevitably reshape relationships and influence within the institution. Some staff members instinctively aligned with Anne's position, believing that the secrecy had gone too far and that transparency was essential. Others felt that Camilla's approach of controlled information management was necessary to prevent chaos and protect the monarchy's public image. The meeting eventually concluded without any neat resolution. Charles had admitted to the emotional and physical toll he had been experiencing, confirming Anne's worst fears about his health and state of mind. but his explanations for why he had handled things as he did remained incomplete, leaving Anne with the sense that there were still layers of truth she had not accessed. The succession-related decisions mentioned in the letter were acknowledged, but not fully detailed, leaving everyone involved with more questions than answers. What had been set in motion? How far along were these plans? Who else knew about them? In the days that followed, the consequences of this internal conflict began to manifest in ways that would eventually become impossible to hide from public view. Anne withdrew from scheduled engagements, unable or unwilling to maintain the pretense of normalcy while processing what she had learned. Her absence did not go unnoticed by royal watchers, who began speculating about possible rifts within the family. Meanwhile, preparations continued for an upcoming public appearance, where both Charles and Anne would be expected to present a united front. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. The institution that prided itself on projecting stability and continuity was internally fractured in ways that threatened to undermine that very image. When the day of the public engagement arrived, the palace had done everything possible to ensure smooth proceedings. Every detail had been choreographed, every moment planned to reinforce the message of royal strength and unity. But no amount of planning could account for the human element, for the way genuine emotion has a tendency to break through even the most carefully constructed performances. Charles appeared before the gathered crowd looking visibly different from his usual composed self. His movements were slower, more deliberate, as if each gesture required conscious effort. His hand trembled slightly as he waved to onlookers, a small detail that cameras captured and broadcast to millions. Anne stood nearby, maintaining her position in the carefully arranged formation of royals. She had prepared herself to fulfill her duty, to stand beside her brother regardless of their private conflicts. But watching him struggle visibly with the demands of the moment, seeing up close the toll that his hidden burdens had taken, proved more affecting than she had anticipated. Her eyes, which she had trained over decades to remain neutral in public settings, betrayed her. Tears welled up despite her best efforts at control. It was a momentary lapse, lasting only seconds. But in the age of constant camera surveillance and instant media dissemination, seconds were enough. The images spread rapidly across news platforms and social media. Within hours, speculation dominated headlines worldwide. What was wrong with King Charles? Why was Princess Anne crying? Royal commentators analyzed every frame of footage, looking for additional clues about what might be happening behind palace walls. The carefully managed narrative that the palace had been working to maintain simply evaporated in the face of such visible evidence that something was seriously wrong. Attempts by palace communications teams to downplay the significance of what had been witnessed fell flat. The public had seen something genuine, something that contradicted the official messaging, and that authenticity resonated more powerfully than any carefully worded statement could counter. The immediate aftermath saw an interesting shift in public sentiment. Anne, whose tears had been so visible, became the focal point of public sympathy and respect. People saw in her reaction something they could understand: a sister's concern for a struggling brother, a loyal family member dealing with difficult circumstances while still trying to fulfill public duties. Her vulnerability, far from diminishing her in the public eye, actually enhanced her standing. She was perceived as honest, as someone who could not and would not hide genuine human emotion behind the royal mask. Meanwhile, Camilla's notable silence and apparent distance from the emotional reality of the situation began to work against her. What had been intended as dignified restraint started to look like coldness or disconnection. Inside the palace, an emergency response took shape. Senior advisors recognized that the situation had moved beyond their ability to manage through normal channels. The public had seen too much, speculation had grown too intense, and the internal divisions had become too apparent to simply paper over with official statements. An emergency council was convened, bringing together key members of the royal family, senior courtiers, and trusted advisors. The agenda was clear and urgent. They needed to determine how to address the public concerns, how to manage the transition of power if Charles's health truly was failing, and how to prevent the monarchy from suffering lasting damage to its credibility and stability.